It was a bright, bustling day at Glamour Cosmetics. The workers exchanged pleasantries, the hum of conversations filling the office. Suddenly, someone rushed in, breathless, announcing that the president was just outside the building. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Tension crept into the air as everyone scrambled to get everything in perfect order. Papers were shuffled, tasks were hurriedly reviewed, and hushed reminders to appear busy bounced across the room. And then, she arrived. The president walked in with a commanding presence, her every step exuding confidence and authority. The workers froze, greeting her in unison as she passed. With a wave of her hand, she coolly ordered everyone to get back to work. Her sharp eyes swept over the room before she strode toward her office. Just before disappearing behind her door, she stopped and addressed the new secretary, instructing him to see her in 30 minutes. His quick response was tinged with nervousness, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm cloud. As time ticked by, the secretary gathered his courage and knocked on her office door. Upon entering, he introduced himself, his name tag glinting faintly under the lights, CEO Choi Jung-woo. She gestured for him to step inside, her piercing gaze already locking onto him. Without hesitation, she brought up the report he had submitted late. Her tone was sharp as she questioned whether he thought it was easy to live off someone else's money. Caught off guard, he bowed deeply, apologizing profusely. He explained that his workload had been overwhelming and that he had only managed to finish the report late at night. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, before asking if the workload was simply too much for him. Flustered, he apologized again, the words tumbling out faster than he could think. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife, but she remained composed, her sharp tone softened just a little as if she had already predicted his response. For a moment, it almost seemed like she might crack a smile, but it stayed carefully hidden behind her professional demeanor. As he stood there, his thoughts wandered. She had a reputation that preceded her, strict, unyielding, and downright terrifying. Around the office, they called her the Great Demon. At first, new employees would laugh at the nickname, brushing it off as office gossip. That is, until they met her. After just one encounter, their laughter would fade, replaced by wide-eyed regret. Some even whispered about quitting on their first day, but wiser heads always talked them down, reminding them that the pay was too good to walk away from. He had once thought the same, but somehow, fate, or bad luck, had landed him as the assistant to the demon CEO herself. She was meticulous to the point of superstition, and many believed her perfectionism brought bad luck to those unlucky enough to work directly under her. At 29, his youth had been sacrificed on the altar of work. His once cute face, now a little worn from years of stress, was a testament to his endless hours of labor. He often joked to himself that he might as well have married his job since it had consumed his life entirely. Later that evening, as he waited at the bus stop, her voice called out, snapping him from his thoughts. Turning, he found her standing there, poised as ever. She casually mentioned that he had done an excellent job organizing the data. Before he could feel any pride, she followed it up with a request, or more like a command, to organize the sales data and send it to her before heading home. He stared at her, stunned. Was she serious? But one glance at her raised brow told him there was no room for negotiation. Swallowing his disbelief, he nodded and agreed, his spirit silently weeping. Back at the office, he got to work, fingers flying across the keyboard. As he sifted through the data, he couldn't help but think about how his life had become an endless cycle of work. Ever since he became her assistant, he had begun tallying the hours of personal time he didn't have. Internally, he cried rivers of despair but quickly consoled himself with one undeniable truth: money was king. Quitting? No way. That would be idiotic. When he finally finished, he brought the data to her office, exhaustion clinging to his every step. Standing before her desk, he asked if there was anything else she needed. She looked up from her work with an almost devilish smirk. Not unless you're volunteering for more, she quipped. He regretted asking instantly. Just as he was about to make his escape, she suddenly hit him with the most unexpected question: "Are you really interested in marriage?" The words hung in the air, and without thinking, he blurted out, "Yes." It took him a second to process what she had just said, and when realization hit, his voice jumped an octave. Wait, what? Marriage? His brain went into overdrive, panic bubbling to the surface as he stammered incoherently. Her gaze was as sharp as ever, and for a moment, it felt like the room had dropped 10 degrees. He thought to himself, no matter how bad this job gets, nothing, and I mean nothing, is scarier than this woman. As he stood there, his mind wandered to a story he'd read as a kid. It was about a man who believed in God. After an accident stranded him in the middle of the sea, he prayed for God to save him. A lifeboat came, but he refused, saying God would come. Then a larger boat arrived, and he still refused, waiting for divine intervention. He drowned, and when he met God, he asked why he hadn't been saved. God told him he'd sent both boats, but the man had turned them away. It had taken him 20 years to understand the lesson in that story. Thinking about it now, he figured it was a reminder not to ignore the opportunities life threw at him. Before he could dig deeper into his thoughts, the president interrupted him. She told him to marry her. He froze. His brain refused to process her words. Marry her? Surely, he'd misheard. He tried to convince himself it was all a big misunderstanding. Maybe she was joking, or she'd lost her mind from overwork. No way she was serious. His innocence was not ready for this kind of curveball. His thoughts jumped to his parents, who had always pressured him to make them proud. As the eldest son, he'd been their only hope to break free from poverty. He promised them he'd study hard, get into a prestigious university, and bring success to the family. He gave up everything for that dream. In high school, he even turned down offers to become an idol because all he could think about was studying. Eventually, he landed a job at a renowned company, only to realize escaping poverty wasn't something that happened overnight. His parents continued to demand more from him, and he felt trapped in an endless cycle of expectations. Snapping back to the present, he told the president he must have misheard her. She repeated herself, making it clear he hadn't. She wasn't joking, she wanted him to marry her. His head spun as he wondered if this was one of those hidden camera pranks. He glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" Instead, she told him to stop wasting time with ridiculous questions. He pointed out that she was saying ridiculous things and asked how he was supposed to marry her. She calmly asked his age. He replied that he was 29. Then, she asked if he had a girlfriend. He said no, thinking to himself that she hadn't exactly left him with any time to date. She then questioned why he couldn't marry her. He hesitated, asking if this was something he really had to do, wondering if she even cared about his opinion. Sensing his frustration, she asked if he was angry. He said he wasn't, but he still had the right to ask questions. She told him to pay attention. The marriage wasn't personal, it was for the survival of the company. He blinked, trying to make sense of what she meant. She asked if he knew about a trading company called Honeyho. He nodded, recalling their discussions about a contract to export to North America with them. She confirmed and asked if he knew their president. He did. The man was famous for valuing trust and perfection, though in his head, he thought the guy was just as terrifyingly strict as she was. She explained that the president of Honeyho had been trying to arrange a marriage for her. Confused, he asked why she hadn't just married the man they recommended. Surely, anyone chosen by Honeyho would be a good match. He grew quiet. If she already had someone lined up, why was she suddenly proposing to him? He wondered if this was some elaborate joke, but quickly dismissed the idea. She wasn't exactly known for her sense of humor. She admitted she'd made a mistake. He asked what kind of mistake, trying to keep up. She confessed that she'd told the president of Honeyho that she already had someone to marry and couldn't meet the man they suggested. His jaw dropped. "Why don't you just tell him you don't want to get married anymore?" he asked, thinking it was a perfectly reasonable solution. She shot him a look and said that wasn't an option. She reminded him of what he'd just said about Honeyho's president. Since the man valued trust above all, going back on her word would likely make them lose his trust entirely. If that happened, the contract would be cancelled, and the company would crumble. She told him if he understood the situation, he could leave. He walked out, replaying her words in his head. If he didn't marry her, the company was doomed. But the whole thing still didn't sit right with him. He spun around, marched back into her office, and said, "I still don't get it." She glared at him, asking what exactly he didn't understand. "No matter how you explain it, this just feels wrong," he muttered. Before she could respond, he bolted out of the office. "Where are you going?" she called after him. Without looking back, he said, "To face reality, because clearly you've been watching too many romantic comedies." As he bolted out the door, she stood there wondering why he was so against marrying her. Did he think she had nothing better to do than sit around watching movies all day? Meanwhile, back at his desk, he was deep in thought, determined not to miss the lifeboat God might send his way. His career felt like a sinking ship, the company on the brink of bankruptcy, and his life teetering on the edge. He had to make a choice. Eventually, he began searching online for resignation letter templates, muttering to himself about how corporate drama wasn't in the job description. The more he thought, the more it struck him that his predicament wouldn't exist if he were just a regular employee. Out of desperation, he started browsing job listings. Every site he visited reminded him how bleak the job market was. The companies that paid well were few and far between, and most of them looked like they'd trade your soul for a paycheck. Frustration bubbled up as he wondered why he had to consider quitting all because of the eccentric president running the show. Lost in his spiraling thoughts, a voice snapped him back to reality. It was the manager, standing by his desk, asking if he was okay. She wanted to know if the director had been nagging him again. She was one of the few people who had worked with the director long enough to handle her quirks without losing her sanity. He admitted the nagging was constant, but then, out of nowhere, asked if she knew what kind of movies the director liked to watch. She blinked in confusion and asked what he meant. He explained he suspected the director had developed a thing for romantic comedies. The manager laughed and said that was news to her. The director didn't even watch TV, let alone movies. Hearing this, he slumped back in his chair, realizing that if the director had come up with this bizarre idea on her own, things were worse than he thought. The manager, curious now, asked what had triggered his suspicions. He hesitated, then spilled the story about the marriage proposal. Her jaw dropped, and she called it insane. He couldn't agree more and asked if she truly understood just how crazy it was. Even talking about it gave him goosebumps. She shook her head and joked that working under the director while keeping a clear mind was nothing short of a miracle. He stared at her and asked how she'd managed to stick around for over a decade, especially since she'd been close to the director for so long. With a smirk, she said, 10 years with her? That's not experience, that's survival. Honestly, it's the kind of miracle they should make movies about. The manager added that anyone who hadn't been proposed to by the director would probably find his situation entertaining, even enviable. Then she joked that maybe the president of the trading company, unaware of how eccentric the director was, might propose to her at their next meeting. He chuckled and agreed that it was possible. He wondered aloud if the person who recommended the director ever regretted their decision. She sighed, questioning why the director couldn't just avoid causing trouble. She could have refused the whole thing with a simple "no," instead of making up some elaborate story, she said. He nodded and replied, "Exactly. That's been driving me crazy too." With a sarcastic smile, she told him he was too valuable to quit over this and that she wouldn't let him walk away so easily. She promised to speak with the director herself. He looked at her with a mix of relief and gratitude, saying she was his only hope, but she quickly warned him not to count on her too much. Later, she strode into the director's office and got straight to the point, asking if she had serious plans to get married soon. The director confirmed, stating with confidence that she intended to marry her subordinate. The manager raised a brow and asked if he had agreed to this. "Not yet," the director admitted. "Are you two even dating?" the manager pressed. The director shook her head. "Nope." The manager stared at her, dumbfounded, and asked how she could propose to someone who'd never even considered it. The director, unfazed, thanked her for the concern but insisted that emotions weren't part of the equation. "So why him?" the manager demanded, arms crossed. The manager's jaw dropped further as the director knew her well, pointing out that his personality wasn't bad, lifestyle. His face was easy on the eyes. I wouldn't have to explain everything. Living together wouldn't be annoying, she added matter-of-factly. The manager blinked, trying to process the logic. So, basically, you've chosen him because he's like a pre-installed app, already there, easy to use, and takes no extra effort. The director gave her a satisfied nod, completely missing the sarcasm. The manager, clearly frustrated, reminded the director that marriage wasn't something one person could decide unilaterally. It wasn't just about convenience. The director, unfazed, asked if there was anything else she wanted to add. The manager shook her head in disbelief and demanded to know why the director had never considered anyone else. Why him, of all people? Why did he have to be dragged into this absurd situation? She added that love should come first before marriage, and marrying the director should at least be something beneficial for him. For the first time, the director seemed to waver. She admitted that maybe she should have given the whole thing more thought. The manager agreed and told her to come up with an actual convincing offer if she was going to suggest marriage. As she turned to leave, she added with a sigh that if it weren't for her, no one would ever be able to understand the director. She was just too baffling. The director, completely unbothered, replied that it was a good thing they weren't the ones getting married. The manager stopped at the door and warned her that no matter what kind of offer she came up with, he might still say no. She added that the world didn't revolve around the director, and if she ever wrote a movie script like this, audiences would throw popcorn at the screen. The director stared at her, baffled, and muttered that she didn't understand why both the manager and her secretary seemed to have the same dramatic tone. 2 days later, there was no sign of the director, no calls, no sudden demands. He felt a wave of relief and even started to believe the whole ordeal might have been a bizarre joke, like something out of April Fool's Day. He silently praised the manager, convinced she'd handled everything, but just as he was enjoying his newfound peace, the phone rang. It was the director. She wanted him in her office. As he walked toward her office, he told himself it was just about work. The person inside was his boss, and he was just her secretary. Nothing more, nothing less. Once inside, she handed him a file without a word. He skimmed through it and immediately frowned. "What is this?" he asked cautiously. She replied matter-of-factly, "It's a contract." He squinted at her. "I can see that, but what kind of contract?" She gave a small smile, like she'd just solved a tricky puzzle. "It's for our marriage. I've outlined some really great conditions for you. Take your time, read carefully, and feel free to add anything I might have missed." He stared at her, completely dumbfounded. A marriage contract? Great conditions? Was this some kind of prank? He reread the document, hoping it would suddenly turn into a regular work report. No such luck. It was exactly what she said it was. As she watched him expectantly, he realized she still didn't get it. Not even a little. This wasn't about terms and conditions, it was about common sense. And that, it seemed, was nowhere in the file. He told the director that he wouldn't sign the contract and that she should read it again herself. The director, unfazed, responded that she had made it this far, so at least he could show some sincerity. He looked at her face, thinking she had the look of a great demon. He finally sighed and said he would give it a try. "Wise decision," she said with a grin. "Go ahead and read it. Afterward, you'll be eager to sign and stamp it." He silently disagreed, thinking he'd never feel that way. As he walked out, he muttered about how ridiculous the whole thing was. At that moment, the manager walked toward him and noticed his frustration. "What's wrong?" she asked. He vented, asking why things had to be this way and explaining that she had handed him a contract. She shrugged and said, "Things just go that way sometimes." He asked her what she had said to the director. "I told her there's no point in marrying you," she replied. A staff member overheard them and repeated, "Marry?" He asked who was getting married, but they quickly assured him that nobody was. The manager added that it wasn't appropriate to discuss this in the office. He disagreed, pointing out that the director clearly didn't think the same way. She explained that if the president insisted on him signing the contract, any unreasonable conditions could make it void. He smirked and said he'd definitely come up with unreasonable conditions. She raised an eyebrow and gave an example, like fighting? Once he returned to his desk, he decided to see just how ridiculous the contract really was. But as he read through it, he couldn't stop. It wasn't ridiculous at all, it was actually pretty good. The contract stipulated that if they both registered the marriage and lived together, one party would pay the other 20 million won as an upfront contract fee, plus an additional 20 million won per month. He thought to himself that he had never received such a high salary. There were also terms stating that one party would cover all living expenses, and they'd both have to follow rules regarding their private rooms. Any major decisions would require discussion, but they had to respect each other's personal space. Oh, and maids would handle the household chores. The contract's main term was that the agreement would last for a year, after which they could either extend it or divorce. The contract also stated that no damage should come to the company once the marriage ended. As he mulled it over, he thought about the downsides. He'd only have to be with the director for a year, but after that, he'd be a divorced man. But, on the other hand, he had nothing to lose. Still, the idea of signing the contract made him uneasy. He was a Confucian at heart, and the conflict within him was real. Just then, the president walked by and asked if he needed more time to think about the contract. She told him she'd wait until lunchtime the next day and expected the signed contract in her office then. He nodded, replying that he'd heard her loud and clear. In his head, he couldn't help but wonder if he was being targeted by a great demon. At the end of the workday, the director went home. The maid, noticing her early departure, asked why she always left so soon. She simply replied, "Because I do." Then, she asked if any deliveries had arrived. The maid said yes, placing the package in her room. She also asked about dinner, to which the director said she'd eat later. Once in her room, she opened the package, which contained a stack of drama books. The next day at work, he greeted the staff he passed along the way. When they saw his tired face, they asked if he had stayed up all night. He admitted that he had. They suggested that if anyone could talk some sense into the president, it was him. He should ask her to give him a job with less stress. After all, he was a handsome man and didn't deserve to risk his life. He thought to himself, wondering why he had spent the whole night thinking about the situation. But he'd already made up his mind, he wouldn't marry her. If she insisted, he'd ask her to add an extra 0 to the contract fee. Just then, a staff member approached and informed him that the president wanted to see him. Surprised, he thought she'd said she'd wait until lunchtime, but now she was calling him early. He knocked on her office door before entering. Once inside, she immediately asked if he had prepared for all the meetings of the day. Then she told him to submit all the reports by Thursday and mentioned that the sales report for the men's product line needed to be edited and turned into a presentation, with a deadline for next week. He nodded and remained silent. She then asked if he had anything to say. He hesitated, unsure if she had called him in because of the contract. "Did you want to discuss the contract?" he asked. She replied that she'd said lunchtime, but if he'd already made up his mind, they could get started now. He stammered, trying to speak. He told himself to be bold and give her a clear answer. He had carefully gone through the contract and had decided not to sign. But when he finally spoke, the words that came out were, "I can't." She smiled and said, "I know." He was taken aback. She continued, saying she had known all along that he wouldn't sign the contract and that it was a pity. He thought to himself, amazed that she had let it go so easily. All those sleepless nights had been for nothing. With a soft sigh, she told him he could leave. He wasn't expecting that kind of reaction. He had thought she would be difficult, pressuring him further, asking how much money he needed, or questioning why he didn't like her. He imagined her following him everywhere, determined to win his heart. But after leaving the office, he started wondering if he was the one caught up in the drama. When the manager heard about the contract, she was surprised and asked if everything had been settled so quickly. He asked if she was shocked. She said that yesterday, he hadn't seemed okay at all. He asked how and why. She, in return, asked what condition he had given the president to make her back down. He told her he hadn't given any conditions, he had just said he couldn't do it. She raised an eyebrow, thinking it was strange, and wondered if something was wrong. He told her not to say anything so creepy. At that moment, a waiter brought their coffee. She commented that it was good, but they hadn't even rung the bell yet. He replied that this kind of service was meant for the secretary. As they were leaving with their orders, he added that he thought the cafe manager liked her. She dismissed it, saying they had known each other for years. Then she added, "It's as unrealistic as saying the manager liked the president." He asked why she had used that example. She asked why the president had changed her mind after acting like she was going to marry him. He told her to lower her voice. Despite being a little curious, he didn't regret his decision. The offer had been unreasonable, but she had made it with such conviction. He wondered why she was giving up so easily and what was really going through her mind. Back in the office, the president sat with the manager, discussing the revenue and expenditure. The manager confirmed it, but then the president clarified, "I'm talking about the dramas I watched last night." The manager was shocked and asked why she'd watched dramas. The president explained that after discussing marriage with both of them the previous day, they had mentioned dramas. So, she thought that if she watched a few, she might get married quickly. The manager reminded her that she had said she wasn't getting married. The president replied that, from what she could see, none of the main characters in those dramas were in their right minds. The manager agreed, noting that anyone could say that. The president continued, saying those characters put too much effort into things that didn't matter. They had money, spent it freely, but still ended up back in old, shabby houses, following each other everywhere. If the marriage she was trying to enter required that much extra time and effort, she had decided to back out. The manager asked if that was really her decision and what she planned to do about Hyun-ho Company. Would she tell them the truth? The president said no. She was going to get married, and she had already calculated everything. Late at night, he entered his house and announced, "I'm home," even though there was no one there. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to the contract he had turned down. He imagined there would have been a washing machine in her house. He reassured himself that he had made the right decision, holding on to his pride because he wasn't the kind of person to settle. Then, a thought crossed his mind, what if there was a second chance, one he couldn't refuse? He quickly dismissed the idea, concluding that he would never get another opportunity. Just then, his phone rang. It was her. He answered and asked why she was calling so late. She told him not to come to work the next day because she needed him for outside work. He asked where they were going, and she told him to be outside his house by 10 in the morning because they would be going together. The next day, he hurried out, wondering what a luxury car was doing in his neighborhood. She rolled down the window and greeted him. She told him to sit next to her. As he got into the car, she instructed the driver to move. He sat quietly, noticing she was dressed even more stylishly than usual. He decided to pretend he didn't notice. Then, he asked where they were going, since he had no details about the location or the work involved. She stayed silent, and he silently prayed it wouldn't be more data work. She told him they'd be out for a while. He wondered if this was the start of some win heart the Chable way strategy. He asked again where they were going. She replied that she had a date in 30 minutes. He asked whose date it was, and she said it was hers. He asked with whom, and she answered, Mr. Charles Stevenson. He was surprised. She added that he was American. He quickly reassured her that nationality didn't matter, before changing his mind and admitting, actually, it kind of does. He asked how, just a week ago, she had been proposing to him. She cut him off, saying his stuttering was bothering her. He said he'd explain when they arrived. Lost in thought, he wondered what was really going on. Could it be? Why had she changed her mind so quickly? Just a few days ago, she had suggested marriage, and now she was going on a date. The man turned to her and asked who he was. She turned back, asking who had told him that her mind had changed. She explained that Stevenson was just an acquaintance, and since her parents were pressuring her to find a partner, she had no choice. But, she added, from the beginning, the person she truly wanted to marry was him. He tapped his head, trying to snap out of it, wondering what was wrong with him. Was he losing his mind? She told him they had arrived. As she walked ahead, he ran after her and asked for a moment. He wanted to know why she had brought him to her date location. She asked if he wasn't her secretary. He said yes, but she cut him off, asking, "But what?" He reminded her that not long ago, she had asked him to marry her. She said yes, and that was exactly why she was having a date. She told him to listen carefully. His job was to check around and see if anyone who knew her was nearby. If rumors spread that she was seeing someone, it could be a problem, especially if it reached Hyun-ho. He confirmed that all he needed to do was observe. She said that was correct and added that because of him, she was going through a lot of trouble. At the very least, he owed her this. He asked what she meant by because of him. She told him it was time to go inside and ordered him to follow her. Then she reminded him that she had already told him to stop lying, and now it was starting to get annoying. As he ran after her, he thought to himself that she was just a cold-blooded workaholic who cared only about business. She sat down with the other man, who complimented her beauty and said that working at a cosmetics company suited her. He added that if it were him, he would buy her company's products just to impress her. From a distance, the one watching them thought to himself that no matter how much she tried to hide it, it was obvious she was the president. Then he noted that the man was talking way too much and being ridiculously loud. Looking at her, he wondered why, if she was the tough boss everyone feared at the office, she was sitting there so quietly. Drop a comment if you want to see a part 2. See you next time.